Hello learners, welcome to this talk on disability and the law. My name is Professor Shubhangi Vaidya from the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies at IGNOU. This is the first of two talks in which we will try and understand the connections between disability, gender and the law and look at some of the important legal provisions and interesting cases which pertain to disability, gender and the law. To begin with, let's try and understand what we mean by the term disability. Disability is a universal feature of the human condition observed throughout history and across cultures. If you just stop and think, you are bound to have come across several persons with different kinds of disabilities in your own life and in your neighborhood, probably even in your families. Disability is something that has always been part of the human condition. However, our attitudes towards disability are extremely problematic in the sense that we try to avoid thinking about it or addressing it in a humanitarian way. So, disability is a physical or a mental limitation due to which an individual is not able to participate in the life of society on the same terms as non-disabled persons. We see that it is usually considered as a curse, as a tragedy, and persons with disability are viewed negatively and discriminated against in all walks of life. However, today we look at disabilities from a very different perspective. We do not look at disability as a curse or a product of bad deeds, etc., as was done in the past. Rather, disabilities are considered as one of the axes of social discrimination, much like gender, class, and other forms of marginalization. However, unlike other kinds of marginalized identities, disability can strike anyone, anytime. Therefore, a term is frequently used: we are all temporarily able-bodied. So the distinction that we make between the able-bodied and the disabled is actually not a very tenable term because, like I've mentioned, anyone can become disabled at any point of time in the life course. According to the World Bank, about 1 billion people in the world, that is about 15% of the population, experience some form of disability. Let's look at disability and its universality. It is a very broad category, and disabilities can be either temporary or permanent. For example, if you break a limb, if you have a fracture, you may be temporarily disabled. However, once your fracture heals, your disability becomes negated. However, there are also permanent disabilities. For instance, persons who may have spinal deformities or persons who may have cognitive disabilities like mental retardation, which is these days known as intellectual disability, or blindness or deafness. These are disabilities which are permanent in nature. Disabilities may be congenital, that is, they may be there when the person is born, when the child is born, or they may be acquired during the course of the lifetime. Disabilities may be physical, for example, locomotor disabilities, in which there are limb problems or limb impairments, and you may have seen persons using calipers or persons using wheelchairs. There are sensory disabilities, for example, blindness or visual impairment. Cognitive disabilities like intellectual disabilities, autism, learning disabilities, and also psychosocial disabilities, which were also known as mental illnesses, but now they are referred to as psychosocial disabilities. Disabilities can be caused by a variety of factors. Like we've mentioned, congenital disabilities are disabilities when a person is born with a particular kind of a disability. However, they can be caused by accidents, natural and man-made calamities, environmental disasters, conflict, and warfare. You are all aware of the number of people who experience permanent disability as a consequence of war, as a consequence of conflict, in which many dangerous weapons are used, which can permanently disable a large section of the population. Disability is also strongly associated with poverty and underdevelopment. So we see that malnutrition, lack of access to primary health facilities, etc., can predispose children to disabilities at an early age. So this is a very, very important factor to bear in mind. But at the same time, we also see that disabilities are not just seen in poorer countries. We also see them in developed and advanced nations where age-related disabilities have become very, very common. For example, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and also lifestyle conditions like diabetes and so on, which can have disabling consequences. So basically, what we are trying to say is that disability is a very broad category, and within this category, you have many, many kinds of disabilities, many, many kinds of circumstances which can cause disabilities. So the universality of disability is something that is very well established and that we need to bear in mind. Let's now look at some of the definitions or terminologies which are used when we talk about disability. Now, we've seen that many terms, many words and usages are used to denote or connote disability and persons with disabilities. And these change with time and across cultures. For example, a common term, handicapped, which has been used for a very, very long time in the English language, we find it is no longer an acceptable term because the notion of handicap, it kind of connotes a person with a cap in hand begging for alms. So it is no longer considered as an appropriate term to speak of persons with disabilities. We see these days a lot of very fancy terms like specially able, differently able, etc. However, persons with disabilities themselves state that these terms do not really convey the discrimination that they experience. In the Indian context, we often use terms like apahij, viklang, and recently a new term divyang has become popular. The term divyang implies that persons with disabilities are not just limited by their physical issues, they have a capacity or a power which transcends these issues. However, the term persons with disabilities is considered the most appropriate term and is the one that is most approved by persons with disabilities themselves. This term has a person-first approach, by which we mean that it is the person who is at the forefront and the disability is not something that is regarded as being greater than the person. So it is the person which is at the center and the disability is something that the individual happens to have as a part of human diversity and difference. Let's now look at two very, very important models or ways of conceptualizing disability. These are the medical and the social models. The medical model, which is something that has been prevalent for a very, very long time, is based on biomedicine. It regards disability as a medical condition or a problem which is to be set right and cured. Therefore, it is the problem of the individual and it is the responsibility of the individual to seek treatment or seek some kind of remedy for his or her problem. So within the medical model, we see that medical and rehabilitation professionals like doctors, therapists, psychiatrists, special educators, etc., are deployed to help to cure or fix the individual. So, to repeat, the medical model locates the issue of disability as a problem of the affected individual. The social model of disability, which has really made a sea change in our perception of disability, regards disability not just as a medical condition, it regards it as a social condition. In other words, negative social attitudes, inaccessible environments, and very, very difficult ways of looking at persons with disabilities result in their exclusion from the normal activities and institutions of society. Let me give an example. For instance, suppose there is a child with visual impairment, a child who cannot see. The medical model would regard this inability to see as a problem of the individual and therefore try to rehabilitate the individual in terms of trying to cure or fix the visual impairment. However, the social model would hold that it is not just the fact that the individual cannot see that is disabling, The fact that the individual may be excluded from education, excluded from participation in the activities of society, considered a burden, considered a curse, not really regarded as a full human being. This is really the problem which makes that individual who cannot see a person with disabilities. So there is a major and fundamental difference between looking at disability from a strictly medical perspective and from a social perspective. I've mentioned two terms, impairment and disability. So let's talk about these in more detail. So impairment refers to a lacking all or part of a limb or having a defective limb, organ or mechanism of the body. So impairment basically refers to the medical or the physiological issue. Disability, however, looks at how society denies an individual who has an impairment his or her human rights. To quote the definition given by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation in 1976, I quote, "Disability is the disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by contemporary social organization, which takes little or no account of people who have impairments and thus excludes them from the mainstream of social activities." Unquote. So as I have emphasized before, excluding individuals with impairments from the normal, so-called normal activities of society, keeping them away from society, looking at them as some kinds of freaks or burdens or incompetent people, in a sense denies their humanity and keeps them away from the mainstream of society. One of the very, very important human rights instruments is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted in 2006. And in its preamble, it states, and I quote, "Disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others." So we see that this is a very, very important definition or a very, very important way of conceptualizing disability. Namely, it is an interaction between impairments and negative attitudes and barriers. So the blame is not placed on the person. It is actually a discussion on the kind of interaction we see between an individual's impairments and what kind of accommodations or what kind of adjustments that society makes to enable that individual to function in an optimal manner in the society. And here, once again, we mention attitudes. We find that attitudes towards individuals with disabilities are almost invariably negative. We assume that persons with disabilities are lesser human beings. They cannot do the same thing as other human beings. They are a problem. They are a burden. They need perpetual care. They are dependents, and so on and so forth. Whereas all these attitudes, in fact, are the product of our social conditioning. We really do not think that they have any basis in actual reality. Let's amplify this issue of disability as a human rights issue. So disability is now understood as an issue of human rights, entitlements, and citizenship. The United Nations and national governments have initiated legislative and policy actions to address the issues of persons with disabilities. Some of the significant landmarks were the International Year of Disabled Persons of 1981, the United Nations Decade of Disabled Persons, which was observed from 1983 to 1992, the Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 20th of December, 1993. There were also very important country-specific legislations. For example, some of the important laws were the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the Disability Discrimination Acts of 1992 in Australia and in the United Kingdom in 1995, and also the Persons with Disabilities Act in India in 1995. So we see that India was also in a leadership role, in a sense, in assuming or in taking up disability legislation, which was very, very forward-thinking. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I mentioned earlier, which was adopted in 2006, India was one of the earliest signatories. And this particular document, the UNCRPD as we call it, is a landmark human rights document. Article 1 states that the objective of the convention is to promote, protect, and ensure the enjoyment of all human rights by all persons with disabilities. The UNCRPD marked a paradigm shift in the way persons with disabilities were perceived, not as objects of charity or pity or care, but rather as persons with dignity, entitled to all human rights, just as all other human beings enjoy their human rights. Let's look at some of the general principles on which the UNCRPD is founded, and these find expression in Article 3 of the Convention. The first is respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, and independence of persons. Non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, respect for difference and acceptance of human diversity, equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, and respect for evolving capacities of children with disabilities and their right to preserve their identities. Let's now take a look at disability in India. As per the 2011 census, out of a population of 1.21 billion in India, which was counted by the 2011 census, about 26.8 million people, that is 2.21% of the total population, are disabled. 8 broad categories of disabilities were counted in the 2011 census, namely disability in seeing, hearing, speech, movement, mental retardation, mental illness, and any other. Of the total disabled population, 56% are male and 44% are female as per the 2011 census. And the majority of disabled people reside in the rural areas. We see that this particular figure of 26.8 million people is often seen as an underestimation, because disability is still such a stigmatized category that a lot of people may perhaps not have reported that either they were disabled or they had a person with disability in the family. In India, we find, along with many other developing countries, that there is a lack of access to education, training, rehabilitation, and employment for persons with disabilities. And this is basically because of the stigma and the invisibilization of persons with disabilities, even though our laws and our policies are extremely human rights oriented and make lots of provisions for persons with disabilities. We also see that there is a lack of access to education, training, rehabilitation, and employment for persons with disabilities. Even though we have reservation in jobs and in institutions of education, we find that the social stigma which exists against persons with disabilities is something that really prevents them from participating in the plans and the policies that have been put in place for them. We find that they are considered a burden on the family, that it is a product of karma that the family has to bear the burden of a person with disability. Persons with disabilities also run a high risk of violence, exploitation, and abuse. And of course, there are gendered inequalities. For instance, men and women or boys and girls with disabilities face different kinds of issues and problems. And we will be discussing the gender dimension of disability in the next lecture. Having understood the meaning of disability, its universality, having looked at the way in which our attitudes or our perceptions of disability have gone over medical, social, and human rights aspects, and also having taken a brief look at disability in the Indian context, let's look now at the legal framework regarding disability in India. Let's begin with some of the important constitutional provisions. we see that the preamble of the Constitution speaks of fundamental rights, and the directive principles of state policy supports a vision of social justice and promotes an equal and just society. Article 14 proclaims equality before the laws and equal protection for all. Reservations and affirmative actions are planned under the equality provision. Article 15 prohibits discrimination on the grounds of religion, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them. Article 32 provides that writ petitions can be filed for violation of fundamental rights. Article 41 states, and I quote, "The state shall, within the limits of its economic capacity and development, make effective provision for securing the right to work, to education, and to public assistance in cases of unemployment, old age, sickness, and disablement." Unquote. Article 46 gives the state the responsibility to promote educational and economic interests of the weaker sections of the society. The Income Tax Act 1961 allows persons with disabilities to obtain extra deductions. Similarly, dependents are entitled to claim maintenance and medical treatment. So we find that within the Constitution, even though specific provisions are not made for persons with disabilities, in a general sense, persons from weaker sections, persons who are experiencing different kinds of marginalizations, in which persons with disabilities would certainly be included, are broadly covered. Let's now look at certain specific laws pertaining to persons with disabilities in India. The Rehabilitation Council of India Act 1992 regulates the training of professionals through standardized courses and recognizes institutions that provide this training. The Persons with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act 1995, as I have mentioned earlier, was the first major disability legislation in the country and one of the few legislations worldwide which really spoke of rights of persons with disabilities. This particular act addressed preventive and promotional aspects of disability, rehabilitation, and education. I'll take this third point again. Okay. This particular act addressed preventive and promotional aspects of disability rehabilitation, like education, employment and vocational training, reservation, unemployment allowances, special insurance schemes, homes for the disabled, research and manpower development, creation of barrier-free environment, etc. Another very important law is the National Trust for Welfare of Persons with Autism, Cerebral Palsy, Mental Retardation, and Multiple Disabilities Act of 1999, commonly known as the National Trust Act. The National Trust for the Welfare of Persons with Autism, Cerebral Palsy, Mental Retardation, and Multiple Disabilities Act of 1999, also known as the National Trust Act, was specially targeted for those disabilities which require a high degree of support so that they can lead an independent life, especially if they have no family or after the death of their parents or guardians. The National Policy for Persons with Disabilities of 2006 addressed physical, educational, and economic rehabilitation of persons with disabilities. The Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016 was a very, very important landmark in disability legislation in India. The list of disabilities was expanded from the 7 disabilities in the PWD Act to 21. And this is a comprehensive rights-based legislation which is in tune with the UNCRPD and which speaks of the rights of persons with disabilities to enjoy the same rights and entitlements as all other citizens. We shall discuss this particular law in greater detail in part 2 of the lecture. The National Mental Health Care Act of 2017 repeals the earlier Mental Health Act of 1987 and is considered a paradigm shift in recognizing the human rights of persons with mental illness and in rejecting negative and derogatory terminology in favor of a more inclusive and positive approach. Let us now sum up some of the important things that have been discussed in this particular talk. Disability is a facet of the human condition and is a universal phenomenon. It has largely been viewed through the lens of negativity and rejection, and persons with disabilities have been viewed as burdens or unwanted dependents. The emergence of the social model and human rights approaches have transformed the understanding of disability from an individual deficit to social exclusion. The legal framework of the country has marched in tune with human rights discourses. In the next lecture, we shall discuss in more detail the interrelation between disability and gender and look at the manner in which the law has addressed these issues. Thank you.